If the kind of things that Heinrich Schliemann dug up at his Sirlik and at Mycenae have a lot to tell us about the Iliad, in the sense that they can tell us that the kind of things that Homer describes in this work of literature could have actually existed, and the kind of places he describes actually did exist, what about the poem itself? What about its composition? And here is where the study of oral culture can help us understand the composition of the Iliad. Living in a society where we read and write just about every day, most of us probably take it for granted that only a civilization with reading and writing could have a complex body of literature, or even literature. But the study of oral culture tells us, in fact, that civilizations where stories are passed down from generation to generation by the spoken word can actually have quite complex bodies of literature. A scholar named Milman Parry was first to champion this idea in the 20s and 30s. Milman Parry traveled to Yugoslavia in the 1930s to study the bards of Yugoslavia, who told stories in poetic form to musical accompaniment. These stories were often about the great deeds of ancestors and were therefore described as epic. They also came in groups called cycles. So cycles were collections of stories about particular heroes or particular wars or particular deeds. He found that these bards used a couple of tricks to help them out as they were telling these stories. Strictly speaking, they hadn't memorized entire stories. And by the way, these stories could be quite long. Milman Parry once recorded a bard telling a story for 36 straight hours. One of these tricks was the fact that they told the stories they were telling in a kind of meter. A meter is the rhythm in which a story is told, not unlike the time signature of music, for those of you who can read music. And he found that the bards who told these stories used epithets, which are drawn-out names of heroes, and stock phrases, which are ways of talking about actions that could be plugged into this meter and help the poet take a pause even as he was talking and think about what he was going to say next. What he was able to do from his travels to Yugoslavia was apply this learning to the study of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And here's what he found. The Iliad and the Odyssey were actually products of oral composition. That is to say, Homer didn't sit down and write out these poems. In any event, he was famously blind, so I guess he couldn't have done that. Instead, he told the stories out loud, and other people heard these stories, told them down through the ages. They weren't actually written down until the 600s in Athens. And here is the meter in which the Iliad and the Odyssey were written. When you look at this, here's what I want you to see. The long dash represents a long syllable, whereas the short hash mark represents a short syllable. So a line of this, if played out with a drum, would sound something like this. And if read out loud, it would sound a bit like this. The Greek that I'll be reading is to the left. Meinen aede thea peliaradio akeleos ulomenen, he muri akaios algeteke polos iptimus sukas aidi proepsen heron. Autos de loria tu que conesen, oionosi te passi dios de telieto bule, ex hu de taprota diesteten irisante, Atreides te anaxandron, kai dios Achilleos. So you can hear that there's a kind of rhythm to this poetry, and you could think of a performance of this as being musical in nature. And right away in these first few lines of the poem, we get one of the tricks that Milman Parry talked about when he did his research in the Balkans. And that is the epithet, or descriptive term used for a person or place that fit the rhythm and can be plugged in according to what the bard needs. Achilles is described as godlike in many places, and in other places in the Iliad, the great runner. And Agamemnon is described as a warlord or a ruler of men. And we get this right away in the first lines of the Iliad. The second thing that Milman Parry learned were about stock phrases. And these are descriptive phrases for describing a given action that fit the rhythm and can be plugged in according to what the bard needs. Think of the time in Book 1 of the Iliad when the Greeks send Chryseis back to her father Chryses in the town of Chryse. And They take many cattle onto the beach and slaughter them for sacrifice to the gods. After the prayers and the strewing of the barley, they slaughtered and flayed the oxen, joined at the thigh bones, and wrapped them up in a layer of fat with cuts of meat on top. If you were to read the entire Iliad, you will probably come across this stock phrase many times. It turns out that the Iliad and the Odyssey are part of a greater set of cycles about the heroic age. The first one that comes to mind is the Heraclid, about Heracles. Another is the Theseid, about Theseus. There's also the Theban cycle, about Cadmus and Oedipus. There's also the Seven Against Thebes cycle, which is about 7 armies attacking Thebes. There's the Argive cycle, about Agamemnon, Orestes, and Electra. There's the Calliduran, about the beginning of the Trojan War. And then there's the Trojan cycle, which we're reading in, which contains the Iliad, the Little Iliad, something called the Iliupersis, which is about the destruction of Troy, the Odyssey, and the Nostoi, which is about the returns home of our heroes. I'd like to put forth these questions. What if Homer isn't actually the original author of the Iliad? What if he's a master storyteller who compiled it and brought it to us in what is closely its final form? Remember, the poet was supposed to have been blind. And remember, too, that it wasn't actually written down and compiled until the 600s in Athens. What if Homer had heard these stories from the generations before him? And what if this poetic tradition stretches all the way back to the time in which it takes place? The last piece of our puzzle is that of linguistics. And here's what linguistics, or the study of languages and how they work, has to tell us about Homer's Iliad. In archaeological digs, not unlike the one Heinrich Schliemann did at Mycenae, and others around the Mediterranean, tablets were found containing the following cryptic symbols. These symbols came to be known as Mycenaean Linear B, and for years linguists were stumped by them. They couldn't figure out what these symbols said, or even what language they were. Finally, in 1952, an architecture student by the name of Michael Ventris figured out that it wasn't an alphabet so much as a syllabary. What's a syllabary? A syllabary is a collection of symbols that represent not individual sounds, like A or B or C in English, but syllables, like ba, ra, ta. Ventris figured out the syllabary represented the Greek language. So people living in sites that were current with Mycenae and other Bronze Age sites around the Mediterranean actually were Greek speakers. So if the places Homer was describing in his stories could have really existed, and the people who were living there were actually Greeks, it's not so hard to imagine that the poetic tradition stretching back through the ages could have accurately described people who were part of Homer's culture doing things that were part of his cultural inheritance. That is to say, there is a connection between Homer, the storyteller, and the people he tells stories about. Just what kind of people were these Greeks? Stay tuned for my lectures on just that.